invention by some evil people that must be rooted out of our culture. Well, I won't talk about that part. That gets too quickly into politics or something. But humans tend to develop hierarchies. Remember, what's the old novel? And they made a movie about where the kids are shipwrecked on the island and, oh yeah, what I'm talking
Lord
about.
of the Flies.
Lord
Yeah.
of the Flies.
Lord of the Flies. They organize. And part of the reason they organize is, of course, because we're all driven to power. But the good side of it is because we need to get organized or else we fall into a kind of chaos that's not good for anybody. So hierarchical thinking is always sort of the answer to the potential for chaos in the human society, social chaos. And so people figure out, basically what I mean by hierarchical, what people have meant through the centuries is somebody needs to be designated to make the decisions. It's not always the same person in various cultures, but all cultures have kind of some kind of structure in which they start at the level of, in ancient society, the ideal society would be where you never meet anybody that is, you're not really clear as to who makes the decisions between you. You know whether you're the one that decides or whether the other person is one that decides. This was very clear in ancient society. And the reason for that was they had found in human experience that if you don't make that decision, the way it's going to be decided is going to be a fight. One is just going to pummel the other one into submission. This is the way you're going to do it. So in order to maintain sort of peace and order in the structure in the society, they would just think ahead of time, no, everybody has their place, and then your task is to fit within that. Now, I go through all of that to say that the family was organized that same way. In fact, there has been a tendency in the history of humanity, and this is true of civilized people, this is true of barbarians, and this is true of savages or whatever name people want to use for various human cultures. Almost always there's something like a family. Now, it may take various forms, but and that's sort of the basic structure. You may have something above that. Let's say a group of hunter-gatherers, in ancient times. They might have a chief or a head warrior or something like that. But basically, the organization was on the basis of something like a familias or maybe a domus. It was something like that. The culture was built on that. I don't want to talk too much about our modern situation, but one of the many issues that come in huge transformations in society is to determine what a family or domus is going to be, or whether you really need them or not. And if you don't have them, then where do you run into the first person that you have to do what they say? This gets very complicated when you're not sure. And but anyway, I won't get into all of that. The fact is that the family had to do with blood, that is, with genetics. Except in the case where someone was adopted into the family. There was all cultures have had that, and some cultures have had it a lot. Native American tribes, there was massive adoption done when they would raid another tribe and carry off captives. Quite often what they would do to those captives is they would actually be adopted into the families because they needed people. We don't realize sometimes, having as many people as we do today, that the human race through most of its history has had trouble surviving because people just died off. You had to have some way to keep building up the population. And so adoption was accepted. But normally this is a blood thing. People who share your genetics are in your family, particularly that smaller group. And it was normally based around one male. And I think you all had maybe talked about the pater familias, the the father of the family. And the family was defined by the people who bore a certain blood relationship or some other kind of social relationship to that particular male. Now, you have to remove from your mind the family being mommy, daddy, and the kids, the 2.5 kids or whatever it is in the modern concept of the nuclear family. I don't know that anybody ever had that in the ancient world or even down through human history. That's a very, very rare, and some people say almost totally modern concept of what a family is. It was always a larger thing than that. It involved more people than that. It tended to be the oldest male. That did not mean there were not other males in the family, even other adult males in the family. But the person who had the final say in the family unit was the oldest male, unless he got to the point health-wise or something that he could not do it anymore. But that would be a very rare kind of case. I'll talk about how that works out sometimes a little bit later. It's interesting that when Rome became an empire and it had an emperor, one of the titles that they gave to the emperor, I think a couple of weeks ago, I brought in a picture of a coin in which it is a picture of the Emperor Augustus. And one of the titles it gives to him on there is Father of his country, Pater Patrias, the father of the country. They were, that is was simply a figure taken from the family in which to say you should think of Augustus and the way you think of the pater in your family, only he is that over the whole empire. Something interesting, I'd like to study this more myself. I've never gotten around to it. You know, Jesus had a family. And it's not like we don't know some things about that family. And we even know some things about his relationships or the relationships of the members of that family. I think the one passage that's always been interesting to me. It's one place you find it in Mark chapter 3, where Jesus is somewhere teaching, and I think it's in verse 20 that it says, some people come to Jesus and say, your family is outside, and they want you to come out. And it says, you know, I've forgotten exactly how this goes, but they think you're crazy. And then he replies, well, I'll tell you who my family is. You know that story? And you think, how is this family, given the way families were organized then, how is this family organized? Is Jesus the pater familias of that family? Where's Joseph? Joseph seems to disappear after the birth story. And I think most people tend to think that he maybe has passed away or something. And it's a family in which you don't have Joseph as the oldest male anymore. And Jesus does not have that relationship of having to obey Joseph because Joseph is not there. But we just don't really know. And there are other cases through the scriptures where the family of Jesus is mentioned. It would bear a little study to see how that all works. And how he related to his family. So that's family. Now we have household, which is a different and a much bigger kind of thing. And it is tied, has the word house in it. It tends to be tied to where people live. This is a group of people who are living together or operating together. There may be some people in the household who don't spend the night there, but they're there. They're part of things during the daytime. And that would be, you have the father, pater familias, but the other people in the family may be related to him by blood and they may not. It's interesting that in the ancient world and in most cultures, just because you have an adult son and just because he's married and has children does not mean that he has left the household or that he does not still bear a hierarchical relationship with his father. his father still has the say. And often when one of the sons has to take the father's place, if the father dies, for example, in some way, the oldest son automatically moves into that position. This is all foredetermined. Everybody knows who they report to in any given case. You have the sons, then when the sons get married, they bring their wives in. And by the way, wives often jump from their family into a new domus, where they become a part of that. They're no longer, are no longer subject to their father. They're subject to the pater familias in the family that they married into. And then the children would be a part of that family. You had so you had in-laws, we would say today, that are in the domus. You have other people. You have slaves. The New Testament usually calls them servants, but that usually means that they are slaves. Although they are part of the family, they're there every day. They have have lodgings there and so on. Then you have people that serve specific tasks, like you have tutors that live with the family. And sometimes they're slaves and sometimes they're free. There's a statement, in the New Testament that says the law of Moses was our tutor to bring us to Christ. So you had that function. You also had when a child was born, quite often you brought in a wet nurse, someone to nurse the child. There are various reasons for that. That was not just true in the wealthy families, though it was almost always true in wealthy families. I'll get back to motherhood in a minute. So all of these people made up the household. So when you read a story in the Bible and it says so-and-so in their household, realize that you may be talking about all of these. Maybe not in every case, but you could be talking about all of these people. And this is all based on the social norms of the day. The New Testament will describe these things, but it never makes any judgment on them. All right. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. By the way, I say that they always knew who was in charge, given come what may. And it is very interesting that we like to talk about most societies and ancient societies being patriarchies, which they were as a general rule, that's true. But it was not all that unusual for the head of the household to be a woman. And there are even in the New Testament 2 cases of households that are headed by a woman. Can anybody, this is for extra points today. Does anybody know who the 2 are?
Lydia?
Lydia is one. Anybody know the other? I'm not surprised. I wouldn't either if I were just hit with this. Actually, a woman named Susanna is mentioned, I think, in Luke. And oddly enough, she is listed as the head of a household of King Herod Agrippa, King Herod Antipas. She's the head of the household. She's also a disciple of Jesus. So that's a very interesting situation. So one story is in Acts 16, the other one is in, can't remember exactly where it is, but anyway, those, Acts 16 is Lydia, and Susanna, I can't remember the passage, but I think it's in Luke. Anyway, my point is that these relationships were flexible, but not, if you're not, don't have a special case, it tended to work the way I told you, the oldest male, and then coming down, everybody knew sort of where they fit into that hierarchy. Okay, a word or two about marriage in general. Marriage was always arranged in the ancient world. It would be extremely rare, an extremely odd situation if a couple decided, hey, let's get married. This is just not the way it was done. It was a social institution, and the pater familias any unmarried woman within his familias or even within his domus, he determined who they married or whether they married. You think, I can't believe people actually live that way. Most human beings through most of history, that's been the system. Our system, fall in love and get married, is a very rare human arrangement. Although sometimes, given our human natures, and which I love, a couple is married by the powers that be, and they fall in love with each other. It's not the most common marriage relationship in the ancient world, but it's not uncommon. I call that companionate marriage. That's a marriage where the person you're married to is also your best friend. And if you're going to go somewhere, you go with them. And if you have an issue, you first talk about it with them. That kind of relationship. That person is a companion. We even, in our culture, sometimes tend to say our companion. But that was not the usual situation. The marriage was arranged. The couple was not expected to fall in love with each other. They were not expected to be companions with each other. They lived pretty much their separate lives, except in the task that they had together, in the major task of the woman in that family, and that was to produce offspring. It all had to do with the production of offspring. And a lot of the rules about human sexuality in human history, certainly in the biblical period, the rules putting various fences around sexual activity had to do with maintaining the integrity of the family. This is what they are concerned about. So a lot more could be said about that, but people were married quite young. Normally the men were between 18 and 20 years old. The women were between 12 and 16. The only thing that determined that you were ready as a woman to get married is whether you were old enough to have children, to get pregnant. If you were old enough to get pregnant, you were old enough to marry. And there was a tendency, because again of the desperation in not having your family die out, that as soon as a woman was able to get pregnant, she immediately was married off. So that her period of life of having children was extended as much as possible, so that she could have as many children in her lifetime as possible. By the way, this just was not just poor women or peasant women. If you were the wife of the emperor of Rome, you were expected to have as many children as possible, as quickly as possible. And you were not expected to have any particular relationship with your husband. Some did. We're thinking about, Antony and Cleopatra. You sort of think that this is a very rare situation. And most of the Roman emperors, you have no idea, and even people who've studied ancient history a lot have no idea who their wife or wives were. You don't know. It's not because they probably were not very impressive people. They just don't enter into the emperor part of the story. And we don't know anything about their relationship. We do know about a few. So, but when young men of this age or young women of this age were married, they were under the patriarch of the family. They did not create a new family by getting married. And in fact, some men knew that they were never going to be the patriarch of any family, despite the fact that they were married and had children. Okay, now I'm going to say a word about polygamy. Polygamy existed in the ancient world. Herod, the king of the story of the baby Jesus, had, I think, 9 wives. He had a lot of wives. It was not unusual for monarchs to have more than one wife. And again, the reason for that was a monarch has got to have an heir, or else there's trouble. Remember Henry VIII? Unfortunately, he had to get rid of the previous wife before he could marry another one, and this became very difficult for the lives of his former wives. In the ancient world, they didn't do it that way. You just married another wife and you married another wife and so on until you got a situation where you had heirs that were suitable to you, because that's to maintain the familias. It was rare outside of royal families, but it was not unknown. And in fact, there's what in the Old Testament, we're not talking about families and marriage in the Old Testament, though they had some of these things, but there's even one rule in the Old Testament, in the law of Moses, that forces polygamy. Do you know what it is? Did you know that the Old Testament says certain men are required to have more than one wife? It's called levirate marriage. And it's marriage where you have, a man has a brother who dies before he has any children. And the living brother is required not only to marry his sister-in-law, but to have children by her, who will then be considered the children of the dead brother. See how the bloodline is driving a lot of these things, even to the point of polygamy. But since polygamy was allowed in levirate marriage, it was also allowed in Judaism. And I had a question from that came from our Zoom class that falls right into this, and I want to mention. The question had to do with polygamy. Why does it say twice in the Bible that elders and deacons in the church are not to be polygamous? It says, you know, that an elder should be the husband of one wife. Specifically says that. Some modern translations say married only once, because it's not clear whether that means they could be a widower, have only been married to one wife, or whether they must currently be married to one wife. I know growing up, I knew churches where when a man's wife passed away, he resigned. He was an elder, he resigned from the eldership, feeling that he was no longer the husband of one wife. Others took that to mean it just means you're married only once. So was there some, what's behind that? You know, we have and the questioner mentioned in the 2nd century, Justin Martyr, criticizes Jewish elders because they still sometimes have more than one wife. In fact, they will allow, he says, up to 4 or 5 wives. And you don't get that in the with the Christian leadership. You know, I'm not, unfortunately, I don't know why that was, except that there seems to be something inherently objectionable to polygamy that has to do with, I think this is why, pardon me for just letting sentence fall on each other, but you know, the passages where it says, now wives obey your husbands. And we think, oh dear, the Bible is okaying, you know, patriarchy. And then it follows by saying, and husbands, love your wives. Remember that that's said in a context where husbands were not required to love their wives. And it was in its own context a liberating statement. The Christian family had something in it that the pagan family did not, and that something was love. You don't find the love between the parents and the children. I'll say more about that in a minute. You don't find it between the husband and wife unless it sort of accidentally happens, coming out of maybe human nature, but it's not the normal thing. And so when the biblical writers say the husband should love their wives, this is a radical idea, and it's a liberating idea for women. There was really not anything the biblical writer could do about the societal norm that said that there was a man in charge of the family. There was a pater familias. It couldn't do anything about that, but it could say, let's introduce something into this familias. Let's introduce love. And when you introduce love into a family, it starts changing the structure. That's why Christian cultures tended eventually to eliminate polygamy. They eliminated it pretty quickly, already by the 2nd century, it's already beginning to be gone. And I don't have time, but I'd love to talk to you about the one example we have of polygamy in our own country in modern times, which was the Mormon experience with polygamy. It's very interesting to read accounts by the plural wives who wrote about what that was like and what that did to the relationships in the family, where there were 2 or 3 or 4 wives within the family. And you begin to see why it's very difficult to maintain the Christian ethic in a polygamous family. I have one other thing I want to say about that, but I'll come back to it. I want to say something about mothers. I said that it was not because people hated women that they sort of gave them their primary task was having children. It was because you couldn't have children without women. And you couldn't have the human race without children. And so it just sort of seemed like that probably was what women ought to do, was to have children. And you know all the stories in the Bible about someone can't have children and the societal shame that came upon them and so on. The Bible doesn't shame them, by the way, for not having children. It's the society that shames them. Again, I'll come back to that in a minute. So, and besides that, half of all children in the ancient world did not survive past the age of 10. Half of them did not survive past the age of 10. About a quarter of them didn't survive to 1 year. And so a married woman understood that it was probably going to be her situation in life to have a child have children as rapidly as her body would allow. Incidentally, in 18th century America, the same thing was true. I studied one of my ancestors who had 15 children, and then out of those 15 children, all had at least 8 or 10 each. You know, and a lot of the reasons were the same as they were in the ancient world. It was just necessary to keep it. And I also studied the women in some of my genealogical ancestors, and these were outstanding, well-educated women, but they had baby after baby after baby after baby. This was expected of them, and they expected it of themselves. And yet, strong child-mother relationships were rare. Just like husband and wife relationships of love were rare, so were child-mother relationships. The children were, even in families that were not wealthy, the children were often not raised by the mother. And part of the reason I think ancient people didn't develop close relationships with their children is because there's too much chance the child was going to die. Mm. And it was just it was just too painful. But it was not necessarily an expected thing. There are exceptions to everything I'm telling you here, okay? But I'm just talking about in the general rule. And especially mothers did not have strong relationships with their sons. I used to see this when I was spending a good bit of time in the Middle East. So you go among like Bedouin, the tribes people there. A woman will raise and take care of a son until he's old enough to sort of run around. And then she turns him over to the man, and that's it. No further relationship between the mother and the son. He just sort of hangs around with the males and does the best he can. And by the way, they don't treat you very well either. Children are not highly regarded in the ancient world. And nobody ever made their schedule around the child's schedule. This just simply was not done. But again, we must move on. It was very clear in the ancient world whether you were a child or whether you were an adult. And it made a lot of difference. And they made it very clear. Of course, we don't, and that's all. Again, I will not get on my soapbox. But somehow we've managed to develop this highly sophisticated society in which young people growing up don't know whether they fall into the category of child or adult. They're not, it's not clear. And it's particularly not clear in the case of young men, males. They really do not know. Most ancient cultures, most human cultures have known that it was a very serious issue to make sure that males know whether they're adults or whether they're children. And they have one set of rules when they're children and one when they're adults, and that they know it. And there always have been, even the most primitive people have these puberty rites and things where, okay, and at the end of it, they say, you are now a man. There's one passage that's very revealing about that in the Bible. It's that one in John where the man is born blind, and there's the discussion about that. And they say, who sinned, this man or his parents? What happened? And the mother says, he is of age, ask him. Look at that story sometime and see how that works in the relationship that everybody has. Look, we're not responsible for that. He's of age, ask him. Well, there was something known as being of age. And sometimes it's very hard for us to know whether somebody's old enough to do this or that. Now, here's the kind of shocking thing, and I'm about to quit here, but marriage and family relationships was considered in the Bible to be a social relationship, not a kingdom relationship. Okay. When Jesus was being questioned about whose wife somebody would be in the resurrection, what did he say? Do you know? Do you remember? We don't. You don't often hear this verse. He says, in the next world, we are neither married nor given in marriage. Marriage is not a kingdom relationship. It's an important relationship, and it's treated with great importance in the Bible, but it belongs to this world. And it's determined by culture, by social culture. And the early Christians bore the same relationship to the familias and to the domus that they did to the emperor, or that they did to the concept of slavery. These were things that belonged to the human world. And what the Christian did was they simply lived with them, while they were living with an entirely different way of treating other human beings, aside from these relationships. So, for example, they would apply love to the family, but a Christian woman still obeyed the paterfamilias and is told to. The Christian writers never say to disobey the social structures. They don't say they're good. They don't say change it if you can. They just say whatever it is, it's this world, it's the way people do things in this world, and you live somewhere else already. Jesus was living the life in the kingdom. I'd like to talk to you about, was Jesus ever married or not? Remember, men got married when they were 18 to 20, and Jesus during his ministry is 30, and where's the wife? And if he didn't get married, why did he not get married? He's in a family, but I won't talk about that. Just leave that for you to think about. Anyway, so the early Christians lived within the social structures. They obeyed the emperor, even though that doesn't mean that God's form of government is monarchy. God's form of government is Jesus as king, and that's the way the Christian lived, because he was living in that kingdom. But in the meantime, the earthly kingdom he's living in, that's something else. I'm taking far too much time. Sorry about this. Just one other thing I want to say, I won't go into it, but it is interesting that this whole imagery that you find in the Bible of the church being both the family of God, the familias, and the domus, the household of God. And there are a number of passages that we could look at in detail in which those terms were taken and to say, that's the way the family, the church on earth is God's family. Given the kind of family that I've described here, are there any implications for the way the church operates or not? I frankly don't know. I've struggled with this now for way over half a century, and I don't know quite what to do with it, but it's very interesting that those analogies are used, that we are the people of God, the family of God. Yes.
And also the whole thing of bridegroom and bride.
I'm sorry?
In the Bible, we're the bridegroom and the bride.
Yes, yes.
So that.
Marriage, right. And marriage, by the way, is in almost all those cases, very highly held up, exalted. The Bible's very big on marriage. So, sorry, I took more time than I should have.
Hey, we can, I'm adaptable. I'm nothing if not adaptable. All right. All right, here are a few texts, that might be helpful for you. Here, Sherry, going that way. This will just, we're gonna jump around a little bit, just to have a few illustrations of some of the things that John has shared with us. So, so it might be helpful to have an extra, does anyone not have a piece of paper? We have a couple. Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I sent it in the group chat as well. Those of you on Zoom, I sent it on the chat there, so you should be able to open that PDF. Let's start with the second page, actually. We'll go a little backward. We'll jump around a little bit. The very bottom of the second page, there are 3 references to what John was just talking about of the family of God, the household of God. So I'm just going to read some of these bolded pieces here in these last 3 chapters and last 3 citations. So starting with Ephesians 2, you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and also members of the household of God. The whole structure is joined together and grows into a holy temple in the Lord, a dwelling place for God. So there's 2 metaphors here for what it means to be invited into the family of God. There's citizenship, which remember we've talked about the emperor as paterfamilias. So citizenship was almost like the family was almost like a microcosm of the nation, the empire in Rome, right? We talked about that last week with the paterfamilias, if you were here. The emperor is paterfamilias, and so the father of the country. So there are a couple like metaphors being used based on their lived experiences. Again, not affirming the emperor structure or the paterfamilias necessarily, but using the language that is shared among people who would have been familiar with it. So citizens as opposed to aliens. So you have all the rights of citizenship and you have all the rights of being in the household of God. So that you see those 2 metaphors coming to light in Ephesians there. Again, in 1 Timothy, the household of God being used again as a metaphor. This time, there's the explanation of why this letter is being written so that you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God. So again, like God as, this metaphor of God as paterfamilias. And so what does it mean to obey the paterfamilias, obey God, be in the household properly, the way one is supposed to be? Again, this is metaphorical language being used to help explain what the church is and how we relate to one another. And then, of course, in 1 John, this is one of many references that we could have pulled, but being called children of God and all the rights and privileges of being an heir of God, adopted into God's family. I like how John says it here in verse 2, we are God's children now. So that adoption language, we're going to do a whole day on adoption in a little while. I think that's in the schedule. We're going to talk about adoption. Okay, so I just wanted to point out some of those. There are many other citations as you're reading the Bible or you're hearing it, perk up when you hear family or citizenship or household, and remember some of this contextual stuff and how that metaphor is being used in the ancient world. In Romans 16, there's this at the very end. So this is the very end of the book of Romans. This is the first longer passage on page 1 of the handout I gave you. There are some really interesting references to household. So Romans 16 can feel really boring if without any context. It's just a long list of names. Most of them, this is the only place that they show up, though not all of them, which is really interesting because there are a few names here that show up multiple times. For example, Priscilla and Aquila are mentioned here. Are they? Yes, I didn't make that up. Yes. I didn't bold them, but yeah, there they are. And so different people are mentioned a few times. And I just wanted to point out a few of the languages that are related to family and household. We get a lot of context here of how like things worked in the ancient world, if you kind of know where to look. But you'll see like greet those who belong to the family of Aristobulus. This is a really interesting, like, greet my fellow Israelite Herodian. We've talked about before in this class how like Israelite was a really outdated term by this point. It's like if I said like greet the colonists in America. Like, no, that's not what we are anymore. Like now, right? Like, so it's kind of an interesting use. So that greet those in the Lord who belong to the family of Narcissus. So we see like these households here that have decided to follow God. Of course, sometimes it's just the head of household who decides and everyone else just follows along, because that's what the expectation was. So we see that with Cornelius, which, yeah, I pulled that chunk here, just a piece of that. We see that with Cornelius. We also see that with Lydia. There's also something interesting here. We haven't talked about benefactors. That's the first bolded section in verse 11 of Romans 16. Verse 1 of Romans 16. Sorry, 2. Yeah, 2. Benefactor and patronage are these ancient things that happened in the Roman culture of like how people participated in the life of other people, and specifically supported people that maybe were outside of their family. So benefactor is an interesting kind of added nuance to these relationships between households or people that weren't in the same familias. And then there's some interesting stuff here. So I pulled this verse from 1 Timothy as well, 1 Timothy 5, as well as this last bolded section in Romans 16, where Paul, similar to what Jesus does a couple times in the Gospels, where like there's this encouragement to see people who are not your family as your family members. While relationships between family members looked different than how we might relate to our parents or our children or our spouses today, there was still family tie, family loyalty, family tenderness, right? Humans are still humans throughout time and space, right? And so we see these really interesting encouragements to see someone who is not your mother as your mother, to see someone who is not your father as your father, to, of course, see other people, especially other people who have chosen to follow Christ, as brothers and sisters, siblings in Christ. And of course, we see from Jesus in particular an admonishment to respect and love children and invite them into God's family in a way that would have been really foreign in the ancient world, and especially in the Roman Empire. So you see that here. Greet his mother, a mother to me also, Paul says. And then in 1 Timothy, we get some really interesting things about widows. I just wanted to kind of plant that here just as something to consider. Widowhood and that kind of thing with marriage added layers of, were just really interesting categories. Widowhood especially, widows in particular were a really interesting category, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, which were very different contexts, but widows had interesting things. Acts 18, I just pulled one little reference to Priscilla and Aquila. And the reason I wanted to point that out was because in more than half of the times that Priscilla and Aquila are mentioned, they're a married couple, Priscilla is listed first. Not every time, which seems to indicate this, like an interesting relationship between them. In the ancient world, the people were listed hierarchically. And so for Priscilla to be named first, it happens in Romans 16:3 as well. Romans 16:3, Greek Prisca and Aquila. Prisca was another name for Priscilla. It's interesting that the woman was named first. And I just wanted to point that out, like there are always exceptions to all of these things that we talk about with like major social dynamics, cultural dynamics. They're always kind of exceptions to the rule. We already talked about Cornelius. And then there's Lydia's household. I also pulled the managers of the household, like the eldership and bishop passages, and I can talk about those. But is there anything I've said that you want to elaborate on or highlight, or any questions before we talk about that? Yeah. Any questions or anything? Observations from what we've covered? I know this is like, I feel like this was like a lot of information today, but.
I was just looking at also First Corinthians, I think 7, about, it seems like Paul was sort of ambivalent about getting married.
Yeah,
Just like, yeah, if you're, that's good for you, go ahead, and if not, all right.
yeah.
You stay where you are in your place, in whatever institution, you talk about slavery too, I think, in that chapter. I just wondering about that ambivalence, is that our attitude, do you think? Is that a good place for us to be?
Well, yeah, that's a very complicated question, actually. I think my personal opinion is that that's coming out of Paul's feeling that these structures belong to this world.
Right.
And Paul, like Jesus, is already living in another world, you know, and it's just sort of a lot of this stuff that happens in the family is not pleasant. I mean, you know, a high percentage of women who had children died during childbirth, for example. And there were all kinds of issues. And so Paul is probably looking at, my personal opinion is that Paul had been married, by the way. We could talk about that sometime, but I think Paul probably had been married. I don't think he's married as an apostle. And he's just looking back and saying, you know, the world is full of troubles and why ask for more? I know that doesn't sound right.
Women are not problems.
I was seeing it.
Well, also we have to remember with those passages as well, there's a lot of evidence in scripture that the ancient, like the first apostles of Jesus, they assumed that Jesus was coming back really soon. Why waste your time on marriage when we have people to bring to Jesus before Jesus comes back? Like there was like a priority level there because of like, there was an urgency that is kind of lost now in understandable ways. Like Jesus didn't come back immediately the way they expected originally. And so there's that facet of it as well. And also, I mean, I think Paul, what I see in Paul is I've learned about kind of Roman context and how, remember last week, for those of you who were here, we talked about how a few passages, there was conformity to Roman culture or Roman law, and then there was a challenge in it, sometimes in the very same verses or very same passages. We looked at ones that both challenged and conformed to Roman culture and law. I think that Paul also recognized that within Roman Empire is this consistent theme throughout the Bible. The Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Roman Empire is not compatible with the ways of God. And so the ways in which you can kind of step out of empire, it makes it, I don't know if easier is the right word, but it's maybe more compatible with the ways of God and the way of Jesus. Jesus stepped out of empire in some really key ways. Not always. There are ways in which we have to conform to whatever culture, language, governmental structure we're in, but also challenged it too.
Also, as far as family is concerned, if you are a part of a family, you have all kinds of obligations and responsibilities. And a man like Paul, who's obsessed with bringing the gospel to the whole world, just can't see how there's compatibility between performing the function of a father and a family and being the apostle to the entire world. That you just can't do both of those. And I've always felt like what look like criticisms of the family are actually growing out of immense respect for the family and for the responsibilities that it brings. And you got to be willing to take on all of those. And often society begins to break down when people start refusing to accept their responsibilities as a part of a family. And I think he just says, I'm afraid I couldn't do that because of my call to be an apostle, so I can't do it.
I know we're really close to, if not at the 10 o'clock mark, but I just want to make one comment about the eldership and bishop requirements and specifically that one woman man line. So first of all, what we should know about First Timothy and Titus, which are on your paper, if you're unfamiliar with the passages, they are as gender neutral as Greek can be. If you know Spanish or French where everything is gendered and you have to say like they, it doesn't exist as like a gender neutral plural. These are as gender neutral as Greek can be written in order to to keep it gender neutral. So they do have some gendered language because it's impossible not to, and that is masculine because that is the default, but they are as gender neutral as they can be. The one woman man, here are a few other theories about what that could mean. One of them is polygamy was instituted because of reproduction. And so it is a value statement on women that women are not exclusively walking wombs, that they are companions as well. And so it encourages a different type of marriage where there is not just unilateral submission, but that there is also love and self-sacrifice on the part of a man. There's also an element to which it's a more democratic thing. So like one theory is that it was expensive to have multiple spouses. And so it's a social status thing to have multiple wives. And so if there were multiple people in leadership and one man had many wives and one man had one wife, and does that make sense? Then there is another form of hierarchy within those relationships. And then remember from last week, we talked about in gendered stuff where women's, there was modesty for women that was different for men in the ancient world and specifically in the Roman Empire. And so this kind of leadership where you're speaking publicly regularly and that kind of thing could have been considered immodest for women. And so we need to think about some of those cultural things. So those are a few theories. Again, like John said, we don't really know, but those are a few additional theories for why one woman man would have showed up. It is the only gendered language in this entire thing, but was considered like a phrase of like just being married once. It could have also been like something more equitable between women who are also in leadership to the extent that was possible.
You know, there's one other little thing about
Yeah.
that. In cultures that have polygamy as sort of the standard, they've almost always found that what they have to do is they have to have a separate household for each wife.
Mhm.
The Mormons did that. The Native Americans did that, and in the ancient world they did it too. If you have a hierarchy, oddly enough, if you have two women in the spot of being the spouse of the paterfamilias, you've got a big problem because who's in charge between those two women? And normally the way they solve that was by saying, well, you've just got to have enough money to have a house for this wife and a domus there and another one here, and then because otherwise you're going to have constant chaos.
Can I come in? You see, and also in Asian Far East, that is in the Arabian Peninsula, the Arab people in Africa, back in Asian day, they got married because of wealth. A man could have his real wife and may have 10 other women Congo bound, and just to have a lot of farm, a lot of production going on. And he used those women for productivity, but you have his real wife.
Yeah.
So that was one of the key factors to having a lot of women. So you can, accumulate a lot of wealth, a lot of money.
Lynn, did you have something you wanted to
I was just asking, when you were talking about the gender neutral language, was there specific scripture?
Oh, both of these, both First Timothy and Titus are as gender neutral as Greek can be,
Got it. Oh, thank you.
while
Okay.
still being in Greek,
Respect.
which like most gendered languages favors the masculine.
Okay.
But yeah, one woman man is kind of the most direct translation of that Greek phrase, and is the only explicitly gendered language in there. But some theories are like, that's a phrase that was like essentially a one spouse. But you can't say that in a gender neutral way in Greek. But those are a few theories. Again, we don't really know. Those are a few theories that, anyway, we're over time, so